welcome to this Ask the Analyst session for the 2025 Fosway 9-Grid for Learning Systems. I'm John Kennard, Content Editor at Fosway Group, Europe's #1 HR industry analyst, and I will be your host for today's session. So, founded in 1996, Fosway Group provides in-depth corporate research on next-gen HR talent and learning practices. We provide analyst and advisory services to more than 3,000 European and international headquartered multinationals and corporates, as well as independent vendor research and EMEA market commentary. Now, before we get into the main body of the session, let me take this moment to tell you about Fosway Corporate Membership. This is a private network for corporate HR, learning and talent leaders offering deeper access to the data and insights behind our core research. Monthly virtual roundtables on key topics, private analyst time, and accelerated buying support as well. There's much more besides this, so please do contact us if you're interested in learning more. Revealing the market and solution trends in the learning systems market, the 2025 9-Grid report shows that while AI is by far the most dominant topic of conversation, uptake and adoption is yet to match the attendant hype around the technology. However, even though adoption may not be widespread, the need for an AI roadmap is at the very least non-negotiable now. Corporates are rapidly accelerating their exploration and engagement with AI, and from a vendor perspective, the risk of falling behind is significant. So there's so much to talk about today, and I'm delighted to welcome lead analyst on this research, Fiona Leteney, as well as Fosway CEO and founder David Wilson, to dissect and discuss all the findings in this latest iteration of the 2025 Fosway 9-Grid for Learning Systems. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. We will have a Q&A session at the end. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. Do use the chat pane. Do play nicely. I will gather up all the questions and ask them at the end or in the moment if it makes sense. But we will have plenty of time for questions. Okay, without further ado, let's move on. David, let's set the scene. Tell us a bit about the research behind the 9-Grids.
Hi, and hello to everybody from me as well. Welcome to another session. We always try and give a little bit of context before we go into the 9-Grid, so just a few minutes really to talk about it. Partly just to give a bit more background on where the information comes from. Each of the 9-Grids is a kind of huge undertaking for us, and there's a lot of background research that goes around. It's an all-year-round process, but then there's a big spike of activity, as you can imagine, leading up to the actual the publication itself. We get a lot of input from our corporate research members, and from roundtables. We do a lot of corporate inquiry related activity and private advisory, obviously, as well. We also run public research processes, and then we run a quite detailed vendor process as well with structured data capture, independent briefings, customer referencing, attendance to user conferences and analyst events, etc., and things like that as well. So each of them is a bit of a monster. There's a lot of effort that goes into it, and we're trying to really synthesize the best view of that. It's not just about filling some forms in and telling us how wonderful they think they are. The vendors included are chosen basically by Fiona and reviewed as part of a peer review process based on relevance to the target audience, which is typically EMEA headquartered enterprise organizations, or at least international global ones. So we're really trying to prioritize this. I mean, there's many vendors. There's probably at least as many, again, we're tracking that aren't in the 9-Grid. But we're trying to work out who are the main options that are in active use and active consideration within those kind of enterprise organizations, particularly when we look at our corporate research network, and some of the innovator companies that we think have a potential to achieve that status very quickly. So we're looking at near-term enterprise class kind of organizations. You can't buy your way on the 9-Grid, and you can't buy your way off it as well. So it's not for the vendors to if they decline, they're declining to provide sometimes input, but they're still actively obviously under consideration, and we still get a lot of customer input around them. So it's really important to understand, both who gets on it, and if you go to the next slide, ultimately where the view comes from. As I said, we're synthesizing it from many sources, But ultimately, the most important point of view is for us is what customers say. So ultimately, the view that we get both around customer references and customer advocacy is hugely important. The vendor input is really important as well, but it's a secondary process. We use it to cross-validate assumptions, maybe spot that certain modules or new things have happened, or they've raised money, or whatever it's going to be. And then use it to cross-validate across it from a research. So nothing that literally is provided by vendors directly to determines position within the 9-grid. It's based on a lot more other factors. We have a huge amount of information. It's a massive, each 9-grid is a bit like a big iceberg, really, where the image and even the report is actually only a very small part of the story. And we have a lot of that data behind. We certainly would emphasize to people to read the report. The reports talk about market and solution trends, which gives you guidance on really how we're weighting the assessment and what we're looking at in terms of particularly things like roadmaps and new developments and innovation as it goes through. It also tells you a bit more around the criteria behind the 9-grid and also the definition of some of the terms, things like the trajectory ratings and things like that we're now including in the reports. So Fiona, do you want to talk to us a bit more about the learning systems?
Sure. So this is the learning systems functional model that we have been using in this sort of 5-pillar format since around about 2020. It had previously been 3, and we did a huge amount of research into specialisms, and so changed that. It also increased significantly the size of the forms that we asked the vendors to fill in with their data. And under each of the subsections, then there can be anywhere between 12 and 30 more questions to make sure that we've got a fully rounded information and data on each of the vendors. It is whether they are a specialist or whether they are a fully functioned suite, they get the same functionality or form to actually fill in, and then we put that into a model that we have, and that influences to a degree the level of within the potential of low, mid and high. But we have all that information available so that if any of the corporates come to us, as we've talked about before, we already have that information to help put together a shortlist. So this as well changes each year. It's not changed as dramatically as it did in 2020, but we check that we have we've got any of the new features that seem to be coming through that we see in briefings are actually included in there. So it's quite an extensive model that we have. So before I actually talk about those headlines that are there, I just want to reiterate a couple of things that David's already said, but they're questions that come up quite regularly, and that is that the focus for the grid is Europe and EMEA. So it's where the enterprise corporate organizations are headquartered. So we often get questions, and it could be from corporates and vendors, as that they're struggling to understand how each of the vendors is positioned on this grid. If it is an organization, a vendor that has actually originated in the US, for example, and then they have started to be seen in UK, Europe, EMEA, then they are likely to start at the left side of the grid, because their performance within Europe is less than maybe it is in the rest of the world. But we'd still bear in mind that they are a global organization. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate that our perception and our conversations with the corporates that are headquartered in Europe influence how the vendors are positioned on the grid. And also just to reiterate that it's enterprise, and if you want to put a figure on this, the bottom line is around about 1,000 employees per organisation. That said, we know, and this is one of the points that is mentioned in the report, that the size of the first-time buyer is getting lower and lower. And those first-time buyers will only need a simple system to start with. The complexity they will never get to use, as they are relatively small if they're just hundreds. And so if you want to look at the grid and that low tier, that's where the first-time buyers should be looking. And they you can see it's, in some respects, compared to the mid-tier, I would say it's almost underserved. And a lot of the vendors within that low tier are desperate to get to the top right, which isn't where they will end up, or should even hope to be at the strategic leader. To get above the top line, it's more about the size, the complexity, and the sophistication of the organization. So I just wanted to mention those couple of things. Other thing to say, there are 49 on the grid this year. That's one less than last year. 4 came off, 3 went on, and again, those that were placed on the grid. So just wanted to point them out. So right in the center of the grid there, in the middle of Core Challenger, you've got Master Plan. Many may not have heard of Master Plan. They are German, and so if you're a buyer in Germany, yes, you will have heard of Master Plan. And that's, again, just to show you the perception of wherever you are sat, which country you're in, then you might not necessarily see it the way that we do. Also, below them in the solid performer zone, we've got StudyTube. StudyTube from the Netherlands. They're doing really well in the Netherlands, but they I think one of the things to think about, and the reasons why we perhaps put some of these onto the grid, is that they are looking to be more international, and therefore for the rest of the vendors, look out, they are on their way. And then finally, I just wanted to mention Cognota, who is on the left side. What I didn't say is there are 25% are specialists, and Cognota is one of those specialists. So that's the square icon on there. Now, this was where David was talking about if they're an innovator. It's a new specialism. It's about learning ops. We see them as potentially disruptive. They are currently operating in the US and have little or no presence in Europe yet. But it's a really interesting offering that they have. And so we wanted to recognize that, and so place them on the grid. There are another couple of names that you might not recognize. And again, I've seen there are quite a few folks from France who will be aware of this. But B-Link in Core Leader, they have changed their name from Cifidis to B-Link. They bought an LXP and then changed the name to that LXP name. So that's it. Although they have been on the grid for a while, they've changed their name. And then the other system that has changed its name was from LMS 365, has now become Sensei, and they are in the Core Leader as well. So those are a few of the bits of data, if you like, about the grid itself. Please ask questions in the chat, and we'll have a look at those. But I'd also like to talk about, and we've put some headlines of what you would potentially see if you read and download and read the marketing trends and the solution trends at the back of the image on the report. So economic impact continues. It is going to have an effect on the market always, but it continues to be a challenge over the last couple of years. And yet it is still a competitive market, a very competitive market, particularly in that mid-market. I mean, you can see the number of vendors that are in that middle tier and it is very competitive. We've noted as well that the English speaking, so quite often if we get sort of American or US based vendors coming over, they will want to kind of make it easy for themselves in a way and come to the UK because of the English speaking. And it's a saturated market, and so it is very competitive. And the other parts of Europe, the DACH market and France are growing, but also in the last couple of years, we've begun to see how the Middle East is beginning to open up, or the vendors are spotting that as quite an interesting market. But there are certain things they need to satisfy for the Middle East, and it's where the data hosting is from that perspective. But to grow at any rate, and that was sort of one of the things with from an economic impact perspective, is that even though there are maybe slow growth or single digit growth, there are a number of people that are bucking that trend, that they are into really strong double digit growth. And just to point out as well, in terms of being able to sort of read the grid a little bit, if we have placed a vendor into a particular zone because of their functionality or their sweet spot of where their customer is, so that's in the vertical, and their performance, but then the trajectory, in other words, the 9 positions within the zone, we've named this last year. And so, for example, if somebody is in the top right of the zone, then they are, we call that excelling. And it means that there is an increase we see as analysts from a trajectory position of direction of travel, that they are ahead of the market trend. So if they are just going with the market, they will be central, they'll be maintaining in the middle. And that is no mean feat in itself, being actually central within the zone. But if they are in both directions, there's a strong roadmap, there is a strong growth, then they will be top right, excelling, that's what we've named it. Or if it's on the right mid side, right mid, but on the right side of the zone, then that's an accelerating. So again, that performance, the growth, they're accelerating compared with the rest of the market. So that's a little bit about the economic side of it. We've got to mention AI. Over the last 18 months, the number of briefings that I've had from vendors, we've been talking about AI all the time, and it has been sometimes has been delivered, but more often than not, it's actually on the roadmap and it's the direction of travel, if you like, from that perspective. But one of the things that surprised me a little bit when we had the results in from the Digital Learning Realities Survey, which was published at the end of last year, we noted that there were quite a number of the respondees were a little bit disappointed about how much had been delivered in their learning systems from an AI perspective. And so, not just because of that, but we, as will be mentioned more about later, we have an AI research project underway. And as we have been doing that alongside the data capture for the 9 grid, one of the things that we're seeing is that although there is a lot of, we've listed quite a number of features that we're asking, do you have this? Is it something that has already been delivered? Is it something that has is on roadmap, or is it in beta? And if you have delivered it, can we talk to a customer? And finding those customers has been a little bit difficult. So what we're seeing is the maturity and the readiness, and that's what we will be testing, if you like, within the research that we're doing, of both the vendor and the buyer with AI, is still at the moment, the buyer is a little cautious and the vendor has not delivered everything that they have been talking about yet. There's a lot on the way. So as I say, the adoption of the AI is still a little cautious. for all sorts of reasons, and it can be different from every organisation. So the other thing that was a real surprise, and a really pleasant surprise in the Digital Learning Reality Survey, was looking at the upskilling piece. So one of the questions that we ask every year is, what are your priorities for the coming year? And every year that we've been doing the survey, the answer has been compliance. This year, for the first time ever, upskilling and reskilling knocked compliance off the top spot. That's not to say that compliance is less important than it's ever been, because it will stay important and only probably increase in its importance. However, the understanding that upskilling and reskilling is a priority, then that has been recognised by a lot of L&D. And I think it is important to say that there is a strategic opportunity for L&D to be involved in this, the skills piece. It's been talked about across the whole of HR, across all the analysts within Fosway. We're all talking about skills and AI. And I think, but where the upskilling and the reskilling happens is in learning and development. Everyone else is either collecting, storing, or updating data. Where we're actually having an effect is in L&D. So there is a strategic opportunity there for L&D to have their feet firmly at the table. Also to mention is the learning experience, optimizing learning, LX for all is the headline there. We've been talking about learning experience for quite some time, and it's not going to go away. It is that learning experience has become even more important for all the buyers. Everybody is looking for that, the improvement and prioritizing it. It might not result in a separate platform that's been traditionally called the LXP. At the high level, the more complex level, large enterprise, then there may be the option to add an additional platform. But at that mid-market, and certainly the low, only one system can be justified or bought. So that learning experience needs to be incorporated into the existing suites. That's one of the reasons why we have seen sometimes a few years ago, if something was designated as a learning experience specialist, then they have since gone on to become a suite because they've added the learning management functionality into that area. So finally, I'm going to mention AI again, and this is coming from the solution trends that we've put there. It's interesting to see that from an AI perspective, we're at fork in the road for a number of situations. I'll mention a few examples. So if we're talking about the search bar in a learning system, then over the last few years, we've been saying that needs to get better. It's no good just searching on title and description. And a lot of the vendors have stepped up and gone to more NLP type, which maybe has AI in the background. And so it's more likely to look like a Google search where you're actually getting answers rather than just getting various resources to potentially go to, which could be overwhelming if it's not filtered really well. So that has been improving, but what we've begun to see as well is that a number of vendors are hedging their bets a little bit by adding in also AI assistants or coaches or chatbots, whichever you want to actually call that, and so that the search is becoming it could be through an AI assistant actually doing the recommendations. So there's two ways that could go in the future. I think at this moment in time, hedging the bets is not a bad thing, because if some of the organizations are not wanting to adopt AI just yet, then they need to have another option for the search. Another area, just as an example of maybe is on the personalization piece. Last year, I was talking about in the report that adaptive it's the ultimate in personalization. And where that is still the case, there is the, if you like, competitor in the wings that's coming on, where the AI assistant could actually provide that personalized, whether it's an answer to a question or whether it's a recommendation, but it is very much personalized as that assistant gets to know the individual and what their needs, maybe what their role is, what their existing skills are, etc. So there's two directions that could potentially go in. And then finally, just as an example of where AI could be having an influence, is that, again, over the last few years, we've talked a little bit about headless learning systems. And that is, what that means is where the learning system front end is maybe the application within the corporate that is very much a corporate application. And therefore you don't see the learning system at all. And I think this is something that will be picked up, as well as the front end might cease to be that Netflix experience of tiles, etc., and actually end up being an AI assistant. So there are a number of options that we could be going in the future, and it'll be interesting to see over the next coming months, years ahead, as actually where we land with all that. David, do you want to add anything? Sorry, I've rabbited on for quite enough time.
I mean, I think we should get to questions. I think the only thing I wanted to really add probably is, particularly at the large enterprise level, I think it's a very interesting, I think you've already mentioned in the mid-tier space, it's very competitive. Most of the vendors who are on a national level are kind of trying to aim to step into that space on a transnational basis. But I think on the large enterprise level, it's a very different kind of different competitive landscape. I mean, the big battle has been between Cornerstone, obviously, which has bought most of its natural competitors at that top end of the market, Saba, SumTotal, Edcast, etc., and others, versus HCM and HCM Learning. And there was a question in there which was asking around, the presence of the HCM vendors, particularly. I think the question was more around SAP, but I mean, SAP and Workday have a very high attach rate now for learning within their enterprise base. And a lot of that is now deployed. So it's a really significant factor. And for Cornerstone, certainly that's one of the main head-to-head competitor spaces. But it's interesting because what we haven't seen is a lot of what we think are clear strategic leaders stepping into that space. There is a vacuum in some ways within the market. We did a research project last year looking at large enterprise learning and looking at some of the kind of, the reality of what that vacuum is. Because obviously, if you're a corporate going out to market, you probably need more options on the table than just your HCM provider plus Cornerstone in terms of a competitive process. So there are obviously other vendors trying to step into that. Docebo has made kind of has not been quiet about really trying to step up to that large enterprise space, but historically was very much more of a mid-market provider, I think. Absorb has kind of also been really competing heavily and has grown quite quickly, continues to grow quite quickly. And then you've got some specialist players, obviously companies like Degreed and Training Orchestra, which have long sold into that, but with a more specialist proposition. And that's really an interesting area of the market to look at. There is clearly an opportunity for companies to step into that and to become more disruptive. But it's also a big step up. The jump from, for example, core leader up to strategic challenger, even less known strategic leader, is a kind of 10x jump in sophistication of both complexity of the platforms to support very large organizations with the diversity of needs that they have, but also around the partner ecosystem, the SIs that you need to have around you to really succeed at that scale with large global enterprise customers. So it's kind of still a challenging space as well. And then obviously with all of the areas, you see the same functional innovation coming on, skills, AI, experience, all those kind of themes are play out at all of those levels as well. So yeah, it's an interesting time in the market. I think the economic factor that Fiona highlighted at the beginning is really significant, because what we're seeing obviously is, particularly in Europe, obviously, companies have cut investment. We've seen that in fact impact the vendors. We're also seeing that the vendors, if they're owned by private equity firms and so on, sometimes not burning quite as brightly as they had done in the past, maybe, and focus more on profitability as well. So the economic factors are impacting the whole market too. So John, maybe a good time to go across to some of the questions, because I see there's quite a few coming in.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, David, and thanks, Fiona. I'm going to go. So Pim, it feels like David has kind of answered your question about SAP and Oracle. So I'm going to go back to Oliver's question, who wanted you to dig in perhaps a little bit more to one of the new entrants to the grid, Cognota, and talk about why, in what way are they disruptive? What is Learn Ops as a new category, Fiona?
Yeah, great question. And so in other parts of software development, you have things like DevOps, and so we've called this Learn Ops because as an L&D department, you are probably getting lots of requests coming in from all parts of the business, and you need to be figuring out what the priorities are and what the how you're actually going to achieve, and what the and even to be able to project manage a lot of these things. And from what I gather, there can be all sorts of different tools that you might use to help you get to the point of being able to then deliver either a piece of formal training, which could be face-to-face, or it could be e-learning or whatever, or a resource. But there's a whole lot of work that goes on before that. And what Cognota does is actually help you through that time. Now, that can get so much more complex as you become, a large organization. And the reason why they're disruptive in that sense is because, and as a specialist, there is no one that we can see that's actually competing in that area. There is a potentially a little bit, you might want something like a training orchestra as opposed to a Cognota, but training orchestra, it's at the output level. They are working at that instructor-led, whether it's in person or virtual level. But Cognota also takes in the digital learning, but it's before you even get to that output piece. So it just feels as though that's something new that's not necessarily being seen in Europe just yet. But yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
I mean, I'd put that in a slightly different way as well, because I think, things that support the administration of learning were fundamental to the whole history of LMS. Training orchestra particularly focuses around the administration of training, and whether that's live or virtual or whatever, and a lot of the operational processes, budgets and management and things that go around that. So I think elements of this have always there in the background. So much of the focus, though, over recent years has been on things like the learner experience and skills and the front end story, I would say. And I think what's interesting around the kind of Cognota position is very much focusing on how do you run a highly efficient, effective learning operation effectively. And in the past, we've talked about running training like a business and those kinds of expressions that have been around for 20 odd years. I think understanding how you think about the operational side is really important as you try and optimize the investment that we put in learning, and the way that aligns to things like the business goals and outcomes that you generate, etc. as well. I think many organizations in the past have been guilty of really focusing on running a BAU, business as usual type operation, with often very relatively low accountability for whether it was effective or having an impact in the business. And I think these are very interesting angles to consider as well, and possibly quite important strategically if you're trying to prove to your C-suite that you're adding a lot more value. So I think that there are definitely interesting angles around it that are worth considering, and it's rather neglected other than in certain aspects like administration processes and things within the learning systems. And it's certainly not been a popular area of focus over the last even 10 years as companies focus much more on the front end experience for the learner, often despite the really quite poor experience for the learning function that was sat behind it. So.
Okay, thank you, David. Chronologically, moving on to Neil's question, he says, I noticed that comparing this year's grid to last, a number of providers have moved from mid to lower cost. Is that indicative of the economic impact or of a saturated marketplace? Any comments, Fiona?
Absolutely. Sorry, I got a note on my crib sheet just to mention the total cost of ownership, and that the fact that the green icons that are at the lower end of total cost of ownership have increased in number, and it isn't the case that they have reduced their costs. It's more that we have moved the banding, so the banding up, so we've included more to be considered as that in that low cost of ownership. Obviously, prices are moving up all the time, and we just needed to make sure that we had a better balance in terms of what was low, mid, and high in terms of that area. So yes, there are more well spotted, and hopefully it makes it a little bit more helpful for a buyer if they're looking for, if that is a driver for them.
And I think that's reflective of a wider thing to understand is this is zero-based every year. So when we build that kind of huge analysis process with all these different inputs, whether it's the functional assessment, whether it's the cost assessment, whether it's the vendor growth or the presence in the market, each year that is rebuilt from scratch. So we can look at it. So what we might consider to be functionally average, 100% of market average this year is different to what 100% of market average last year was, because first of all, the vendors have kind of moved up. So somebody can add functionality and go backwards in a relative ranking because others have added a lot more. And I think there are some vendors that I think have looked at pricing in a slightly different way. But generally, as Fiona said, the overall trend is for obviously things get more expensive over time, and particularly services over the last couple of years have continued to get quite a lot more expensive. There are other things around cost involved as well. So as companies add other modules, or one of the things I know is a question around AI. In some vendors are charging extra for AI, some are including it in it. So all of the time, this moves the parameters around where we're looking. And then what we try and do, this is not a linear scoring process. We basically map all this out, and then we try and band it into this higher, mid, and lower things, whether that's around TCO or presence or performance, etc., and things like this as well. So it's constantly being rebalanced on an annual basis. And there's quite a strong peer review process. And one of the things is, have we got too many? It's easy to put things in mid-banding and then realize that actually that's wrong, but sometimes it's not, something that's on a higher cost could be 100 times more expensive than something that's lower cost, right? So it's not like it's just, again, a linear scale that you're trying to judge.
Okay, thank you, David. A question around AI, Gen AI. In terms of search, discovery, and curation, how much does Gen AI provide? How much does Gen AI provided add a model and additional cost as opposed to build into the core? Oliver's assumption is that this will become a commodity in itself pretty soon. What do you think, Fiona?
This is another good question. I think who is going to foot the bill for the AI, Gen AI? however it's being used in the systems is an interesting one. I think the assumption probably going back 18 months, 2 years was that because ChatGPT happened to be free, it was always going to be free. That's not the case. There's a huge amount of cost that goes on in the background, and that's one of the questions that we've been asking as part of this process this year is how are you increasing the costs, and it's there's almost as many ways as there are vendors. Sometimes it will be part of the core as you're saying, and there will be just an increase. Either it will be taken in to as a cost to the vendor initially, or it's part of a module, an additional AI module, or there is also one or two are trialing a credit-based system where, particularly on the Gen AI from an authoring perspective, if you have got a certain number of credits, and if you create a piece of content using the Gen AI, the system will tell you how many, before you launch it, how many credits that's going to cost you. So, there are different ways, and as I say, that could potentially be an output that we might do in the future if we can get something that is coherent across the whole of the market, to talk about a little bit in the research that we do on AI. But yeah, cost is going to be a huge influence over the coming years, I think, of Gen AI.
I think the other part of the question is around, though, is also what becomes table stakes or not, right? And I think the other side of it, so it's also very clear that creating a sort of bolt-on with a Gen AI interface around stuff has been a very not an easy thing to do, but it's much easier than building your own unique AI strategy within the tools. And therefore, pretty much every vendor has done it or is in the process of doing it. But the maturity of those, the reality of what those things deliver, is highly variable from one to another. It's not a level playing field by any stretch of the imagination. And I think there are also real questions around the validity of the outputs that are being created around this, and the impact for customers, etc. as well. So I think we're a long way from feeling that AI is just is going to become a commodity piece. And in some ways, it's also changing the problem we're trying to solve quite significantly as well as Fiona said earlier, the way that we interface to that problem, moving away from things like search and the quotes Netflix experience towards a much more AI coach driven, dynamically assembling kind of learning pathways and content and stuff on the fly as we go and stuff. I'm not sure anybody really understands where the end of that journey is and where we're going to end up going to. So I think we're still in the early days with the AI side of things. One of the things I say a lot is there's a reason why companies have valued it. Companies like Nvidia and the other Mag 7 companies are at sometimes trillions of dollars. It's because they expect that a lot of companies are going to be paying a lot of money for application services running in those hyperscalers or on those chips. So someone somewhere has got to be paying for that. Yeah, and it isn't necessarily going to be the application vendor. So I think we've got to, we still don't know, and there is a competitive difference between vendors in terms of pricing strategy around AI, and we haven't yet seen where the end state of that is either. So I think both functionally, we're a long way from that commodity piece, and also commercially as well. So at the moment, it's still the Wild West, I would say, probably, rather than anything more sophisticated than that.
Okay, thanks, David. I'm going to combine these two questions, although I don't know whether you want to speculate, but Emily and Neil talking about acquisitions and the impact of Cornerstone, obviously something that you covered quite extensively in the large enterprise learning paper, which everyone can read in our knowledge centre. Emily asked for the lower systems. I don't know whether she's necessarily talking about presence or total cost of ownership, perhaps both. How at risk are they of being acquired by the bigger players? It's a difficult question to answer, perhaps. Neil asking, lots of European providers popping up. How likely are Cornerstone to acquire them? I don't know if you've got a comment there, Fiona.
I think one of the things I will say, and one of the reasons why a number of learning systems have disappeared from the grid over the last couple of years, the one this year was Illumi, because they were purchased by Dayforce. And I think that's an interesting acquisition strategy that could continue. David was talking earlier about the HCM threat in a way to best of breed. And that doesn't just stay at that high level, it is actually coming down the chart as well. So there is the potential for learning systems to be purchased by HCMs, or actually some regions. I did hear of one particular vendor wanting to buy another one that's on the grid and another one on the grid that actually didn't happen in the end. But I think the consolidation of systems, I think, will continue, and yeah, it just interesting to see that. David, I'll let you.
Yeah, I mean, we spend a lot of time internally talking about the whole M&A space and how, and obviously I think in the large enterprise market, that was obviously quite a significant factor, because the main learning suite providers who were really the main head-to-head in that were the ones that were sort of effectively consolidated into Cornerstone. But it's very true across all areas of the market. Cornerstone's been very acquisitive in terms of specialism as well. So recently bought Skyhive, which is obviously a skills intelligence infrastructure and so on. It's also bought, we know Edcast before, which was obviously LXP/skills provider, bought Tailspin to create immersive learning and things like this as well. So there's a lot of stuff like that going on, and that's also been reflected into the mid space as well, where companies are trying to really boost their capability around now things like skills or other kind of modalities of learning, potentially making acquisitions around it. And as Fiona said, geographically as well, that's also quite important. Somebody can be big in the US but have relatively limited presence in EMEA. They're trying to fast track that process, or maybe a French vendor. I mean, in the past, someone like 360 Learning acquiring Loop, etc. So this has been going on all the time. There's no sign of it slowing down, I don't think. And the HCM vendors, of course, are also making acquisitions as well. So yeah, I think it's an area, arguably, when the market gets also harder and valuations get more realistic. If you go and say how much somebody's company's worth, then that also is something that does accentuate it. Plus, obviously, they've also got the AI factor. So whilst I think engaging with Gen AI is something that everybody can do without having to have gone and acquired. Like in the past, if you were trying to really accelerate a machine learning strategy, companies went out and bought an AI company to do that. They don't need to do that to get into Gen AI, but I think to create a leadership position, you need more than just a bolt-on, right? You need to actually really think about it internally. And some of this is that the acquisitions are more for talent, even, having people who really understand how to make this happen. So I don't think there's any sign of it slowing down. And also the cross-fertilization, as skills has become much more strategically important to HR and to HCM, then obviously they're also playing much more within that learning ecosystem as well. And there's acquisitions around that, like, Dayforce Illumi is a good example of it as well. We wouldn't necessarily, by the way, just take somebody off because they get acquired. The reason that generally they come off is because they're no longer able to be included in a learning systems focused thing. So you need to buy, for example, the HCM suite to go alongside it. In the case of Illumi, it's being re-architected to fit into the Dayforce stack. The only exceptions we have around that have been with Workday and Oracle, partly because there's such a huge comparison at the top level. SAP, you can obviously buy SAP SuccessFactors Learning separately. Workday and Oracle are obviously a big consideration if you're strategically into those platforms. We felt it was we were getting asked a lot at the large enterprise level about the comparison between those and Cornerstone and some of the other options as well. So that's why we ended up including them in the 9 grid. So yeah, M&A will be a huge factor, I'm pretty sure, over the next 12 months again.
Thanks, David. Just to head off your comment, Robert, about trustworthiness of Gen AI. More on this later, but we have 2 large projects, or several large projects, about AI and learning and HR in 2025, which we will talk about in a bit. But going back to Oliver's question around the mid-sector, putting price pressure on strategic leaders, do you see this at all, Fiona?
I think it depends where the driver is in an organization. I know, how's the best way to answer this? Yes, cost can be a pressure to strategic leaders, but if you need the sophistication and depth of functionality that a strategic leader is going to provide you with, then it doesn't necessarily come down to cost in those areas. However, if it is that you have in the first place purchased a strategic leader just because it was a strategic leader, and that happens a lot, then it may be in the next round you are looking at something that is perhaps less the total cost of ownership is lower. So yeah, I think there's always that competition there, but it really does depend where you're coming from originally, and it potentially is more about whether what you are purchasing actually provides you with what you need. And also one of the big drivers, and this is changing the subject slightly, but it's whether you can have a partnership with that vendor. It can end up being more about the partnership rather than necessarily costs, or even functionality. To be honest, with some of the research that we did in large enterprise, that was the outcome was, we want to be able to influence the roadmap, and therefore we have gone for a vendor that isn't a strategic leader vendor. I'm not sure, you could probably do a better job at answering that question, David, but
yeah, no, there is the mid-market is very competitive, and there is a lot more cost competition within it. There are definitely large enterprise organizations, as Fiona has said, that overbought historically. They maybe don't necessarily need the complexity. And if you're in, I don't know, retail or hospitality or whatever, where you're in a very, very tight margin business, obviously there's always pressure around price on there. I don't think we've particularly seen that mid-enterprise pricing has forced large enterprise vendors to reduce their costs. But I think what we have seen is that obviously it's made it harder sometimes for large enterprise vendors to come down into mid-market, because there's no doubt that Cornerstone and even SAP and Workday, for example, has also been looking at, and selling into mid-enterprise as well. I mean, the definition of for some of those of large enterprises, 3,500 employees, for example, which for us is still, that's at the lower end of mid-enterprise, I think, in terms of the way we would look at it. But what is more interesting there is, I think, the opportunity for the mid-enterprise vendors to go up the value chain and to charge more. And in particular, there's a lot of, the gap between those two in price terms is actually can be quite significant. It's not just about software licensing, though. Remember, this is TCO. So it's also around cost of deployment. It's about cost of operation. It's around cost of innovation and so on. And this is obviously one of the biggest differences between the mid-market solution and large enterprise. Is typically in large enterprise, it's things like systems integrators and big consultancies that are doing the deployment. the cost of that deployment is significantly larger, maybe 10 times what the cost of deployment in a mid-enterprise type solution is, which is maybe being done by the vendor themselves or a boutique partner that they have. So from that perspective, you've got to think about it a little bit more holistically as well. But, you know, I think one of the regions that some of those other vendors are trying to step up into the large enterprise space is because, you know, they're looking for a larger deal value. They're looking to be able to serve those customers, not just with higher license numbers, but a higher cost per user as well. And that obviously there is a spectrum there that they can kind of fit into in what I talked about as that vacuum in the market. So I think they're being sucked into that because they're aspiring to take advantage of some of that higher cost potential in some ways.
Thanks, David. I think we have time for one more question before we move on to a couple of very important slides at the end as well. So I'm going to come back to one of our favourite topics, which is the LXP, and a question from Oliver, who is asking about Gen AI providing learning on demand. The need of an LXP might be changed. Do you see trends of vendors disrupting current LXP players, or are LXP vendors transitioning fast enough into this scenario themselves? You've covered this extensively, Fiona.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I mean, one of the things that we say in the 9-grid report is that although there is the rise of the learning experience, there is also a demise of the LXP. Now, we see that, as I mentioned earlier, that at that large enterprise level, there is potentially the opportunity to add in an LXP, but at mid-market there isn't. From a there is definitely.
Why is that, Fiona?
So
that's an important thing. Why you can't just make that statement. The reason for that is because the complexity of the learning systems is so high. Companies have had to invest in an independent layer, and also now in the mid-market, people want a one-stop shop and buying, which also come with LXP like functionality anyway. So when we talk about the demise of LXP as a buying segment, it's not because learning experience has gone away. It's because, you know, that the opposite is true for that. But the reality is the market for an independent solution was pretty much limited anyway to the large enterprise market only. And secondly, you know, that market, the competition in that market has largely evaporated in some ways because Cornerstone acquiring Edcast, it was Edcast versus Degreed was the main head-to-head in that situation. Degreed had already morphed on to becoming a skills solution. So the LXP vendors are absolutely evolving to do that. And while some companies will still position themselves as if they're an LXP, the market for an independent LXP is just really not big enough now to support that. They're competing against all the other learning suites for it. And there will always be occasions for that segmented buy, but it's very rare. And it's certainly the use case that was true for a period in the market with, you know, very management orientated LMSs and a need to create a differentiated experience has changed hugely from where it was 10 years ago, you know, when that term was first kind of created. The other thing, obviously, the other part is the AI piece on the story, right? And that, as Fiona said earlier, has really will change the game when you're starting to engage with AI coaches that are assembling answers for people. The idea that a learning experience platform is needed to provide a personalized kind of learning things becomes really quite a challenge, you know, and it's not clear where the role of it is anymore. And I think we're in the middle of that ground of trying to work out where the end state will be. So I do think it is impacting the LXP, but the LXP proposition even further. But, you know, this is a general problem we've got to kind of, we're trying to determine where this is all going to land, and AI is definitely disrupting it.
And I think that some of those LXP specialists, or Degreed in particular, are looking at the AI piece and where that takes them. They have, you know, the depth of skills that they are doing as well. So they are obviously recognise the issue and are working on an interesting roadmap in terms of dealing with that, which is why they moved up a step in the in strategic leader zone this year. So, John, I think you want to be able to move on.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for all your questions. Sorry we didn't get round to asking all of them, but if you link up on LinkedIn, I'm sure Fiona will answer questions if she can. So a couple of very important slides before we finish. One is about our strategic research project in 2025, AI in HR, talent and learning. David, you can do a much better summing up of it than I can, so please.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit within Fiona has within the session today, but I mean, AI is obviously a massive noise in all of the segments we're looking at, whether it's cloud HR or talent or recruiting or learning or whatever. But there's so much hype and so much noise. Understanding what is real and what isn't is really a challenge. Most of the corporates we're talking to are still at very early stages in terms of understanding AI. There's obviously, if you're European organizations, there's other challenges around regulation and so on that to be dealt with. I think understanding what's real, what's hype, understanding where the business case is, what the investment is, understanding where AI best lives in your ecosystem. You know, it's not a standalone learning system issue. There's multiple parts of the learning ecosystem trying to own this. There's different parts of the HR ecosystem, and then your strategic IT platforms are also trying to own this as well. So I think, you know, the opportunity here, if you're interested in, is to as a corporate particularly, is to engage, get involved in this research, not just to provide an input to it. You know, this is not about surveys. This is about really understanding what people are doing underneath it. And there's an opportunity for companies, if they're interested, to be a core participant in that and actually build their own questions into that process and really get a much more detailed insight about actually what's really going on. I mean, one of the things you will see us talk about is not just some of the trends around this, but things like we're looking a lot around vendor heat maps, you know, on vendor roadmaps, and the heat map around where is that innovation really going? How much of it is live? How much of it is only in the pipeline? How fast will that change, and all these kinds of things. So I think there's a lot of noise, but not a lot of real insight. And I think this is a huge opportunity to really be part of a process at a very deep granular level as well, to look at, understand what's really going on.
Perfect. Thanks, David. If we skip on to the next one, just to say that the research is just the start. There's plenty of other services available. Fosway corporate membership to access the tools behind the research, corporate roundtables, one-to-one analyst time, accelerated buying support. Do scan the QR code to register your interest. And other than that, there's also the Fosway Group Knowledge Centre, which is quite a new element of our site, which pulls together all the research from over the years, be it the 9 grids, the realities, viewpoint papers, infographics, various decks, presentations. Do explore it. And of course, the next 9 grid on the way is digital learning this time next week, and then talent acquisition after that. So there's plenty to be going on with this year. Just remains me to thank David and Fiona for their time, and everybody for yours as well, and all the questions. This recording will be up on our YouTube channel as well as on fosway.com, and we will see you for the next one. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.